Welcome back, and this is the third video in bone tissue. We're going to zoom into the compact bone and we're going to see how that's all assembled and put together, and this is going to be part of your anatomy test for bone tissue. Also, just as an FYI, we do have models like these in the bone room, so if you want to come in and actually look at one of these models in person, you are more than welcome to do so. A lot of times it helps if you have the model in front of you so you can see it. But I'm going to try to show you these pictures and we're going to draw it out ourselves so you'll have a better understanding of it. So when you do come in to look at the model, you'll understand what you're looking at. So if we go back to my generic bone, my generic long bone that I've been drawing for this series, there we go. If you remember, on the outermost parts of the bone, of the long bone shaft, is called compact bone, and it's called compact bone because it's just that. It's compact, it's very dense, and it's very hard, which is why we want it on the outside. We want it to be the outside protective layers of the bone. So here I am drawing. If you look at this, if I had cut this bone in half and we're looking into the half of the bone, you'll see these layers, which I'm drawing as pink, and this is the compact bone, and it encircles the entire outside layers of the bone. It finally stops and it leaves this cavity here in the middle, and this cavity is where we have the yellow bone marrow. So I'm going to do this. We keep yellow bone marrow in here, and as you age, the marrow kind of goes away, or it just stays as yellow because the yellow traps fat. But either way, it leaves this cavity in the middle here, and this is called the medullary cavity. Medullary just meaning middle. And outside of the bone, don't forget, we have this little blanket that comes around, and it's called the periosteum. And I'm just drawing it like this, so it's kind of a cutaway so we can see underneath the periosteum. But this actually wraps all the way around the bone. It's kind of like I call it the candy wrapper, or the blanket. If you roll something up in a blanket, that's what the periosteum is. And the periosteum is connected to the bone by Sharpie's fibers, which is this kind of like Velcro type substance that is on the inside of the periosteum, and it sticks itself to the surface of the bone. So the surface of the bone, the exterior surface of the bone, if you take the periosteum away, that exterior surface of the bone is what we're talking about in the pink. That's the compact bone. And what this model is if you take a slice out of this bone, like a wedge-shaped slice out of this bone, like here. So it covers mostly the compact bone, and it gets just a little bit into the medullary cavity. That's what we're looking at here. We're looking at this slice that was taken out of part of the bone. And here would be the medullary cavity right in here. And all of this is part of that compact bone. So what we're going to be looking at is up close the compact bone and all the components that go into it. Now in that compact bone, the pink part of the bone that I was showing you, there are two major components. There are the bone cells, which are called osteocytes, and there is the bony matrix, which is pretty much the stuff that all of the stuff that goes around the osteocytes. Now the bone cells, the osteocytes, are responsible for making the bony matrix around it. So if you look down here, you start with a cell. Here's a bone cell. And that's not really what it looks like, but just for the sake of explanation, there's my bone cell. And the bone cell secretes different proteins and hormones and enzymes and all of this stuff. It secretes outward, outside of the cell, and what it secretes, what it makes up, is the bony matrix, which ends up forming around the bone cells themselves. So as you can see, the bone cell actually lives in this kind of hollowed out little room that it made for itself right inside the boundaries of where the bone matrix that it made lies. So you have the bone cell, and the bone cell lives in this little room that it made, and it made that by secreting all of this bony matrix stuff around it, and the bony matrix stays around it, but it gives the bone cell a little bit of room to breathe. So you have this space right around the bone cell, just a little tiny space, like it's a little circular spherical space right around the bone cell, kind of to give the bone cell just a little bit of room. So the bone cell itself is called the osteocyte, and we'll get into how it actually forms the matrix and makes things later in the fourth video, but right now I just want you to understand the anatomy of this. So the osteocyte is the bone cell itself here in the center. Now all this black space, the room that is around the osteocyte, that is called a lacuna. And lacuna literally means lake. So I don't know where they got lake, or I don't know where they got lake as a name for a room around a bone cell, but it is what it is. So the name of the room the osteocyte lives in is called the lacuna, or plural, it would be L-A-C-U-N-A-E, lacunae, that would be plural. And believe me, there are many of these. And then the bony matrix is on the outside of the room. Okay, so you have the osteocyte, the bone cell is in the middle. There's a little bit of room around the osteocyte as the osteocyte secretes the bony matrix. The room around the osteocyte is called the lacuna, so the bony matrix that the osteocyte is secreting ends up forming around that lacuna, around the room or the house where the osteocyte lives. Now as far as the bony matrix itself, the bony matrix is made up of two components, the osteoid, which are the organic substances, and the hydroxyapatites, which are the inorganic substances. Now this is important because The osteoid, the organic substances secreted by the osteocyte, are ground substance, so that's kind of like the sticky substance that keeps everything gelled together, and collagen fibers. So ground substance and collagen fibers make up the organic portion of the bony matrix. Now the inorganic portion of the bony matrix, the hydroxyapatites, that's where it stores minerals to make it hard. To harden the bone. And those minerals are things like calcium, phosphates, and also it has some water in there. So these two things make up the bony matrix. The bony matrix is what surrounds the cell in a substance, in a hardened substance. And within that hardened substance is a little room called the lacuna. And within that lacuna is the osteocyte itself, is the cell in the center of that lacuna. So what exactly does that bony matrix do that's formed around the lacuna holding the cell, the osteocyte in it? Where does that bony matrix go and what does it do? Well, in the previous drawing, I kind of tricked you because I drew it in like a circular fashion around the lacuna, the room, which is around the cell. But really, this bony matrix doesn't make this little squiggly line circle. Really what this bony matrix turns into is layers. There's just layers upon layers of this bony matrix. And remember, the bony matrix is the collagen and fibers and the minerals, the calcium and stuff like that, that makes bone hard. So it makes these layers, and I'll just draw a layer there, that's supposed to be a layer. It makes these layers on top of each other, just like that. And it starts to make these thick walls of just layers upon layers of bony matrix. Now these layers themselves do end up forming a circular pattern, but we'll get to that in a minute. The layers are called lamella. You usually, when you're talking about lamella, there's usually a word, a modifier word that comes before lamella, so you can know what type of lamella you're talking about, because lamella comes in different forms in the bone. It comes straight up and down like layers like that. It also bends around and turns into these rings, kind of like rings on a tree. So here's one layer of lamella, but it doesn't normally just do one layer of lamella, it does several layers of lamella, these rings inside each other like this. So when they're rings inside of each other, making this big target looking unit, these are called concentric lamella. And concentric just means circles inside of other circles. Now, when we're looking at a piece of bone, of compact bone, and I'll just keep this wedge shape since that's what we had drawn on the previous slide. When you're looking at this compact bone like this, you can literally see these concentric lamella, these layers, all scrunched up together. And it does this all throughout the compact bone like this. Now, naturally, as you can see, when you're filling up an area with circles, you can't fill up the whole area. There is going to be there's going to be gaps in between the circles where the circles don't fit perfectly next to each other, because it's not like they're cubes that they would fit perfectly next to each other with no spaces. These have spaces in between them, in between these concentric lamella. Okay, but these spaces are also made out of the exact same layers that the concentric lamella are called, but it's just when it's in these spaces and not in that circular shape, that is called interstitial lamella. And remember, inter just means between. So the lamella that comes in between these circular units are called interstitial lamella. The circular units themselves are made up of concentric lamella. And when you put a lot of those layers of concentric lamella together, getting larger and larger as you go outward, eventually it stops making concentric lamella, and that's it. It's just like as I drew down here, they end up making a unit that's just so big, and then they fit all these units together inside of the compact bone. Well, these units made up of the concentric lamella are called an osteon. And an osteon is the major unit of compact bone. So we're going to call these circular pieces of layers that forms one whole circle with concentric rings within it, that is an osteon. And it has, the osteon itself is not just the lamella. The lamella is just the layers that makes up the rings. But within those rings we have like we have an artery coming out of there, we have a vein coming out of there, and many different things. So the entire unit with everything else that goes along with it, the artery and the vein and all of the different little features, that's what's called the osteon. So here's the deal with the osteon. So far I've been drawing the osteon as a series of concentric circles or concentric rings, circles inside each other of sheets of lamellae. So we call them concentric lamellae. But really what we're looking at, this is the top view of an osteon. This is the bird's eye view looking down onto it, and this is what it looks like. Like if you were to cut a tree open, or if you were to cut a tree in half and look at the trunk, you could count the rings in the tree. So this is the top view of the osteon. Because really, the osteon is made up, these lamella, these concentric lamella, these are actually sheets of lamellae that go around, that are wrapped around each other in a cylinder shape. So we'll just do that. We'll give it three rings. So actually, this lamella, or this osteon rather, is a cylinder shape like this. And the lamella, each layer of lamella is one whole sheet that is wrapped around. And it's wrapped around another layer of lamella that's a whole sheet that wraps all the way around. And then in the center of these, sheets of lamella that are wrapped around each other, this concentric lamella, there is a central canal. There's a opening, a space in the very center where the lamella have quit making their concentric rings. And within that space, that is where the artery and that is where a vein goes into to nourish the bone, the compact bone, or the osteon unit. So each osteon has these concentric lamella shaped in these sheets that form rings around rings of each other. And then in the center, there is a hole. Now this is not to be confused with the room that the osteocyte lives in. Remember we talked about the lacuna, which is like a room, and within that lacuna, the osteocyte, the bone cell, lives. This is a completely different hole. This is a completely different thing. So you can keep this in mind for later. I'll show you where these are in the bone, but they are not here. This is not what we're talking about. This hole, the one that we're talking about in the osteon, this is called the central canal. And that is where the artery and vein go down into. This can also be called the Haversian canal, if you run into that in your textbooks. Just because I think some guy named Haversian had mapped all this out at one point and he wanted to put his name on it. So they're also called the Haversian canals. But you can call them the central canal. You just have to check with your teacher in case your teacher wants you to specifically say Haversian canal or not. But the general term for it is the central canal. And again, the arteries and one artery, and actually it's a very small artery. And what do we call a very small artery? A capillary. So this is actually a capillary. And a very small vein. And what do we call a very small vein? A very small vein is a venule. So artery, vein, capillary, venule, whichever you want to call them so you can remember. So here's our osteon, and it's, you know, like a roll of paper towels or something. There's layers upon layers of lacuna, concentric lacuna. Oops, I actually said lacuna and I meant lamella. And then in the center is the central canal. easy to remember because it's in the center of the osteon. And you have a capillary and a venule, which are just fancy terms to describe small arteries and small veins. But there's more to this osteon than just that, because if you cut this open, and I'm going to try to draw this, I'm going to try to draw an osteon where we cut it in half, so you only see the back half of it and you can see it opened. Here we are. So here is a layer. Here's another layer of lamella. Here's another layer of lamella. Here's another layer of lamella. And then in the center there, there's the central canal. So here is the other side, the layers of lamella. And this is if I were to cut this osteon in half long ways so we can see into it. So here would be the venule going down the central canal. And here would be the capillary going down the central canal. But here's what I want to show you about the osteon. Within these layers, here's all these layers of lamella wrapped together like a roll of paper towels. Inside these, in between these layers of lamella, there are little gaps. There are little tiny holes, little gaps where the lamella is not manufactured. It makes room for these little tiny openings, these holes. And these are just little spherical holes. These holes don't go all the way through the layers of the lamella. It's just, they're just little spheres. Now, inside these little spheres, this is where the osteocytes live. The bone cells, the osteocytes. And remember that I was telling you the osteocytes lives in a little room called the lacuna? Well, these little holes in between the layers of the concentric lamella, these are the lacuna. So these gaps or holes are the lacuna. And let me get a different light color here. Inside the lacuna, inside each lacuna is one osteocyte. And the osteocyte lives in the lacuna. And these are where the actual bone cells are. So this is the bone cell, the osteocyte, this light blue dot inside of the lacuna. That's where the bone cell is. All of this lamella, these layers going around it, this is all part of the Boney Matrix that I mentioned. And the Boney Matrix has two components. It has the osteoid components, which is the organic, and it has the hydroxyapatite, which is the inorganics. So the organics, the osteoid, is what is ground substance, and that's the ground substance is kind of like the mesh to a carpet. It's the stuff that grounds everything. It's what everything is connected to, so it stays in place. The ground substance and collagen fibers. Those are the organic portions of the bony matrix. And then the hydroxyapatite, the inorganic portions of the bony matrix, are the minerals to make it hard. So that's in all of this lamella, these layers that go around that do the concentric circles. And then in between the concentric circles of the lamella, in between the concentric layers, are those lacuna, and inside the lacuna are the osteocytes. Now here's one more thing about the osteocytes living in those lacuna, in those little rooms in between the layers of the lamella layers. The osteocytes, they have little hands. They do like this hands across America thing, and they can reach out, and they reach out through the layers of lamella, and this is how they communicate with one another. So they have there's these little canals, and they have, I guess you can, for lack of a better term, you can call them arms. But they have these little canals with little arms that reach out on either side and reach out to the neighboring osteocytes in the neighboring lacuna. And so they communicate, they pass information, they pass nutrition to one another. And these little tiny canals that branch from cell to cell through the walls of the lamella, these little tiny branches are called Canaliculi. So canal, it has the word canal in it because they're canals that connect the cells to each other through the layers of lamellae. And iculi, I just consider that a suffix term to say very small. So very small canals. They connect between each osteocyte in the lacuna. Because see, how else would these bone cells get any nutrition from this artery in the central canal? Because this artery, or this capillary, which is a small artery, just runs down the central canal like that. So it has to be able to get the nutrition from the blood out to the bone cells, and the bone cells also need to communicate with each other. So all of these little canals are running through perpendicularly, running through the layers of lamellae, so these bone cells can get together and exchange nutrients and wastes. The wastes would go back into the vein and leave the system. Through the vein, but you'll get more into nutrients and waste in arteries and veins when you study the circulatory system. But all these little canals that connect the bone cells together through the layers of lamellae, they are called caniculi. Now, one more thing, to go back to, since the lamellae is made of the bony matrix, and the bony matrix is made up of osteoids and hydroxyapatite, and the osteoids are ground substance and collagen fibers. The ground substance kind of holds everything together. But there's one thing about these concentric lamellae and this osteon the way it's constructed, which is pretty cool. And it has to do with the collagen fibers from the osteoid component of the bony matrix. So before I had an osteon drawn here to the left, so now I'm going to kind of unravel it, and I'm going to draw it so you can see in the layers inside. So here would be the central canal, the capillary coming out, and the venule coming out. And surrounding that is a layer of lamellae. Now surrounding that layer of lamellae, that cylinder of lamellae, of course there is another, since these are circles within circles, these are circular layers, cylinders within cylinders. So then there's another layer of lamellae that comes and wraps around in a cylinder around that one. And then there is another layer of lamellae that wraps around that cylinder, and that makes a cylinder. So I'm drawing this osteon if we were to pull it out, kind of unravel it, so you can see the way it's constructed inside. So here's another layer of lamellae in a cylinder shape. So, and I think that's good enough. We get the idea. Now, how these lamellae, and once again, these are just the different layers of lamellae. These are all the concentric lamellae of the osteon. They're just pulled out so you can see inside what it looks like. Now, here's the thing. I said this had to do with collagen fibers. So here's what it has to do with collagen fibers. If you were to pull these concentric lamellae out, like I just did here in this drawing, you would notice, and you could actually see this, on the each layer of lamellae has collagen fibers in it, and let's say this first layer of lamellae, the collagen fibers are going to go diagonal like this. And the diagonal is for strength, because if the collagen just went up and down in like a striped fashion, then it could be easily ripped apart. If it went up and down horizontally, it could be broken apart real easily. So the collagen fibers of the lamellae go in a diagonal fashion. I'm going to make these green so you can see them. Now, here's the interesting part. This is just one ring of a layer of lamellae in the osteon. Now, the layer inside of that outer layer in the osteon, it's still a layer of lamellae, and it's still made of the same stuff. But check this out. The collagen fibers that make up this layer of lamellae go diagonally in the opposite direction. And this is just how the concentric lamellae develop. They know somehow that the layer of lamellae around it has collagen fibers going one way, so their collagen fibers go the other way. And so on and so forth with the inside, the layer of lamellae inside the second layer. These have collagen fibers making up the bony matrix, the lamellae, and the collagen fibers run diagonally the opposite way, and so on and so forth. Collagen fibers go diagonally and they run the opposite way. Now, why is this? What this does is this gives it super strength. I'll just say super strength. That's not really a technical term, but super strength. It protects it from torsion. And torsion is just the twisting that you get when you move your bones around. Because if you just had collagen fibers making up this lamellae running up and down like we had, and if you twisted it around, it would give you a fracture. You would fracture your bones really easily. So since the lamellae are made of diagonal fibers, and the diagonal fibers alternate from one direction to the next, each layer in the osteon, it protects it from all kinds of twisting around. If you've ever taken a dance class and you do a spin, or if you're in ballet and you do a pirouette, you could easily break your ankle spinning on your foot because of the twisting motion if your bones did not have this structure to it. So this protects it from torsion or a twisting motion. This collagen fibers going diagonally one way and diagonally the next way in each layer of the lamella in an osteon. So here is a diagram of compact bone, and now that we've gone through some of this stuff, you should be able to recognize it and not get overwhelmed by everything that's going on in this picture. Let's check out, first of all, this is the same kind of wedge that I drew out of the exterior or the most external layer of a long bone. It's just in a different position. So this would be the outside of the bone. And this crazy looking stuff right in here, this is the inside cavity of the bone, the medullary cavity. And this is going to be the inside cavity of the bone. So we're dealing with this stuff right here, the compact bone, which is the outer layers of a long bone. So as you can see, look at all of these osteons. See, I'm circling this big unit right here. Here's another osteon. Here's another osteon. These are the osteons, the set of concentric lamellae. And you can see in the osteon, in each osteon, there are individual little rings, and each individual little rings are the space in between each layer of lamellae. Here's a ring. Here's a ring. And so you can actually visibly see each individual layer of lamellae wrapping around each other in a cylinder shape. And this whole cylinder unit is called the osteon. So osteon is the bone unit. Now it's not a bone cell. It's made up of cells, but it's bigger than a cell. It's many cells put together. It's a bone unit. And then also, as you can see in the layers of lamella these little gaps, these little pockets. And these little pockets in between the layers of lamellae are the lacuna. And within the lacuna are the osteocytes, the actual bone cells themselves. If you look over at this picture right here, you can see the central canal, or also called the Haversian canal, if that's important to your teacher for you to know. It's the same thing. And here is a capillary, which is just a miniature artery. That's all a capillary is. And then next to it is the venule, which is a miniature vein. That's all that is. And that runs up and down the central canal. And looking in between these layers here, see, you see all of these little canals running crossways in between each lamellae layer, and they run all the way up to the central canal, so they can get nourishment from the blood and they can dump off their waste into the vein. And then these little canals connect each individual osteocyte and its lacuna to the next one in the neighboring layer. And these little teeny tiny canals are called Canaliculi. And they connect the bone cells, the osteocytes, to each other. And, let's see, to each other and to the central canal. Also, if you want to look at the drawing right down here, this is similar to the drawing that I just did. This is an osteon, but the layers are pulled out so you can see inside. Now, do you see the collagen fibers in a diagonal direction? These collagen fibers that make up the lamellae? See, this one is running this direction diagonally, and so the layers surrounding it, the collagen fibers are going to be running in the other direction diagonally. And then the layers surrounding that, the collagen fibers are going to be in the other direction diagonally. And this prevents fracture from twisting, a twisting motion. This stands up and provides strength against torsion. Now, two more things I want to point out to you on this diagram about the compact bone in our long bones. If you remember, I drew like a little generic long bone. It looks more like a dog biscuit, I know. But here is the mythical long bone. And inside that long bone, the most external layers are these layers of compact bone. This is the compact bone in here, and this is the compact bone on this side, on the most external part of the long bone. And so this pink is what we're talking about when I'm showing you this triangle right here. Inside of that, inside of the compact bone in that long bone, there is a cavity that has stuff in it, usually yellow bone marrow. And this is the medullary cavity. And the medullary cavity is what is being shown over here. This little matrix, this little goopy looking weird matrix stuff. This is the very inside cavity of a long bone. So if you notice, if you look at this, what we're doing is we're cutting out a triangle, a little wedge shaped, out of this long bone that I drew, and that's what this diagram is, all blown up. Now if you look at the diagram, you'll notice that not the osteons are not the only things in this wedge. See, we have, oh, I missed one. We have the osteon here, these big ring units. Here's an osteon units. So here's an osteon unit that they pulled out for you. So we have several osteon units. But as I showed you before in a previous picture that I drew, when you put circles or cylinders together to form the compact bone, you're going to have spaces in between those cylinders because they're circle shaped. So you can't fit the circles together without having extra shape in between them. So I'm going to color this hot pink in between all of these osteons. See how between these osteons there's this other stuff, this filler stuff, that helps link the osteons together and hold the bone together and keep the structure. So this pink, this is called interstitial lamellae. So it's still the exact same ingredients, if you will, the exact same structures that make up the osteon. It's still lamellae. We just don't call it concentric lamellae anymore because the lamellae is not in the form of a concentric circles like it is in the osteon. When it's stuffed in between the osteons for filler, it's called interstitial lamellae, and inter just means between. So between the osteons are the interstitial lamellae. Now, one more type of lamellae that's in this bone, the very outside of the bone, which I'm highlighting in like a light blue, this is the very outside of the bone. So the periosteum would be wrapped around here outside. If you notice that there are not osteons right at the edge of the outside of the bone. Instead, there are just sheets of lamellae going around and around just straight, like this. And that's just for a little added protection. So the actual outside of the outermost layer of a compact bone are just flat layers of lamellae that go around the entire bone. So these would keep going and go around the entire circumference of a bone. So that's why we call them the circumferential lamellae, because they're sheets of lamellae that run around the entire circumference of the bone. And oh, I just saw it already typed up here, circumferential lamellae. So that would be these layers of lamellae, these flat sheets of lamellae that are not forming osteons, that are just running around on the outside of the bone like a shell. Okay? And of course, we can't forget, as an added bonus, we have one more series of canals to consider. And if you think about the central canals, inside each osteon, in the center of each osteon that goes all the way down the cylinder. Here's another osteon, here's a central canal, and I'm just drawing it in red because we know we have a capillary, a small artery that runs down. So these run up and down the length of the cylinder. But so if they run up and down the length of the cylinder, they would just be isolated and they wouldn't really be connected to each other. How can these central canals, these vessels, optimize their circulation within the bone? Well, they also have canals that go across and cut across and connect each central canal to the next central canal. And I'm doing these in purple. So see these purple ones? They run perpendicular wise. They run across, connecting each central canal to the other central canals. And they too have an artery or a capillary, which is a miniature artery. And they also have a venule, which is a miniature vein that runs through, connecting to the capillary and vein in each central canal. So since these canals are perpendicular to the central canals, and they run through the layers of lamella, they go through the layers of lamella, connecting each osteon to each osteon. And these are called the perforating canals. Because they perforate or penetrate through all of those layers of lamella to get to the next osteon. So they connect the central canals of each osteon to each other. Now, I'm going to do another video, the fourth in this series, about bone tissue. And it's going to be about how bone tissue is actually made and the cells, what the cells do, what the cells' functions are, and how they create all of this bony matrix and this lamellae. And so that's going to be in the fourth video. But this should give you an idea of the anatomy of the bone units that make up the compact bone. So we have the osteons with the central canals. We have the perforating canals that connect those central canals to each other. We have the osteocyte, the actual bone cell itself, inside lacuna in between lamellar layers, and the lamella makes layers in concentric rings around each other, around the central canal, and each unit of that is called an osteon. So I hope this made sense, and join me for the fourth video when we talk about the ossification of the bone.